Thank you for having me, Janet. It's such an honor to be talking to you. I've been watching the work that you do for a long time, and I've heard amazing things about you and Tribe Sober. So this is
Oh,
very
thank you.
exciting for me. My name is Nicci Clutie, and I am a life coach and a mindfulness trainer for corporates. I'm a yoga teacher, and I am a mother of two magnificent children, a preteen or a tween and a teenager. And I live in Scarborough. I moved to Scarborough just over a year ago from Stellenbosch. And I'm busy settling into a new tribe, a different tribe, trying to find my tribe. And I turned 50 last week. So it feels like this is a very auspicious time in my life.
Okay. Happy birthday for last week.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I know that you've been sober for at least a decade now. Can you cast your mind back and tell us your drinking story?
It's actually coming up to 10 years in January. January
Okay.
2024 will be 10 years. I can't believe that I've stopped counting the minutes, hours, and days like I used to when I first stopped drinking. I, like many people, started drinking as a response, a misguided response to childhood trauma. I led beautiful fairy tale childhood until the age of 13 when we had a home invasion. And yeah, I was raped in my bed under my parents' roof. And even though I got all the support that I think many young girls of that age wouldn't have got at that time, in terms of medical, legal, etc., it was the mid or actually close to the late 80s, and there was absolutely no question of mental health impact. I had a few days off school and then I went back to school, and the message that I received or inferred was to put a smile on my face and to carry on. And I did that
Poor you. I'm so
masterfully.
sorry to hear that. It's just
Ah,
horrific.
thank you, Janet. I realize it's a really powerful thing, and I drop it into conversations now because it's so long ago and I'm so well versed in it. But now that my daughter is exactly that age, I can actually feel and see what a thing it was, and especially in the absence of coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
So my schoolwork started to plummet, or my grades started to plummet, and my behavior started becoming very unlovely. And I I turned to alcohol.
Yeah.
So I started stealing booze out of my parents' wine cabinet. Growing up in Stellenbosch, surrounded by winelands, we had cupboards and cupboards full of bottles of wine. And it was just something that I started experimenting with, telling myself that I was a naughty teenager because, of course, it coincided with hitting puberty and all the normal hormonal fluctuations that go along with that. And I discovered that it was a wonderful way of not having to deal with any of the difficult emotions and the
Yeah.
flashbacks and the
Yeah.
proper PTSD that
Yeah.
just wasn't even diagnosed.
No.
That's when it started, and it pretty much continued in various shapes and forms up until the age of 40 when I stopped.
Many people start drinking as teenagers, don't they? And some people
Yes,
grow out of it, but some of us don't.
right.
So, what happened as you got into your 20s and you started building a career?
Yeah, so for the reasons you mentioned, my drinking behavior, my problematic drinking behavior, very much went under the radar because I was labeled as a naughty teenager. I used to grab a bottle of wine, drink it in the morning before I even got to school. And then I'd arrive at school at first break, drunk, to Rhenish Girls High, a beautiful school, and a wonderful school, and no one would bat an eyelid. And I continued to master or to hone the skill of drinking undercover and then integrating myself into society. By the time I got to the end of the last year of school, I sorted myself out somewhat because I had a wonderful boyfriend who helped me to see that I actually did have value as an individual, as a human. I'd gone through all the suicidal ideations and all the self-harm during these teenage years. But by matric, it really looked like I'd sorted myself out. And I was prefect and I was head of house and I got that allowed me to go to university. And then through university, everyone drinks. Certainly, yeah.
Was it Stellenbosch?
It was in Stellenbosch. And I lived in a house full of wonderful young people, and drinking was a big part of our life. And I do remember drinking in a way that was different to them. And I do remember noting it. And I do remember even then starting to have what I now know, blackouts.
So you were a binge drinker really once you started. There was no off switch.
Absolutely. And the impacts, the subtle but long-lasting impacts started happening then already, with me deciding to skip my final French exam because there was a house party, and I thought, oh, I'll just carry those credits over to the next year because I feel like drinking tonight with everyone else. So it looked like I was doing the same as everyone else, but I was already starting to really sabotage myself. And I then went to London after I graduated. I went to London, and of course there it was work hard, play hard. I got into recruitment, and it was absolutely par for the course that you would be at work at 7 in the morning and you'd work until 7 at night, and then you'd go to the pub and get absolutely hammered. Everyone would get hammered, and it was great bonding because the next morning you drag yourself into the office. I remember at 10 o'clock there'd be a sandwich man who'd come around, and you'd get your the Trinity, the packet of crisps, the soft drink and a chocolate, and power through until the next night, or that night when you'd go out and do it all again.
Yeah, I did that too, and we'd compare hangovers in the morning. Oh, I'm so fragile this morning, and it was almost a badge of honour, wasn't it, the hangover?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it was also there, though, that I started looking at my flatmates and seeing that I was drinking differently to them, because they were also, we'd all go out together, but they would have many days where they wouldn't drink. I was always finding a flatmate who could drink with me. And I remember even waking up in the middle of the night to go to have a wee, and stopping in this grimy little flat in Southfield, stopping in the lounge and having a cigarette, because I still smoked at that point as well. And if there was a glass of wine on the table, just having a little sip of that. And it was an absolutely integral part of the fabric of my life.
Yeah.
And that was where I had one or two horrific blackouts where I'd wake up in the morning and I'd know that I'd got home safely, but I couldn't remember how. And that started making me think, here I was in the heart of London, sitting in a bus shelter. But nevertheless, I continued.
Yeah, we take so many risks, don't we? I had the same kind of work hard, play hard nonsense going on. And when I look back now, I think, wow, I was so fortunate in a way. So many things could have gone horribly wrong.
Oh, Janet, it is absolutely terrifying to think back. I remember my now ex-husband saying to me once when we were living together, and he was also partying hard. I remember him saying, God, last night they poured you through the letterbox. You were that hammered. Someone would point a cab in the direction of my house and deliver me. And yeah, he said you were poured through the letterbox. And we both thought it was funny.
Oh, yeah, we do. We turn it
And
into a funny story, don't we? I nearly drowned in my bath once when I was 25. I just passed out and I had to be resuscitated and everything. And we turned that into a funny story. It was, did you hear about Janet and her bath? What an idiot. And when I
absolutely
think back, why
terrifying.
didn't I get some help back then? It was so obvious now. But I thought of myself as someone that just went over the top now and again. I didn't have a
Yes.
problem.
Yes, exactly. I recall as well that I had one or two partners in crime who I could always call on them to go for drinks. And we would try hard to limit ourselves to a glass. And I remember in London in those days, you could either get a big glass or a small glass. And a big glass was essentially half a bottle of wine. And we'd go and try to hold each other accountable. But of course, the wheels would come off. And
Yeah.
so it was something that was done together. And I think
Yeah.
that also made it feel more acceptable.
Yeah.
But
Did
it
you
was
ever drink alone?
all the time.
Yeah.
All the
Just checking.
time. Yeah, all the time. And in
Yeah.
particular, the thing is, I didn't need to drink on my own a lot initially because I always lived with quite a lot of people. But it was when I broke up with my now ex-husband. And it was when I moved to a flat where I was living with one chap and his fiancée. And I was on my own and I'd never drink with them. And I would get absolutely hammered in my room. And I was so ashamed of it. And I remember they were really clean living. And I remember feeling so ashamed of how I was self medicating because I knew that I was trying to nurse my broken heart through drowning myself in wine. And they must have known what was going on. But I would still emerge the next day, groomed, and go off to work. To all intents and purposes, I looked like I had it all together. So it was this
Yeah.
dreadful shame
Yeah.
factor being
Yeah.
woven in, and the secrets, hiding
And
the
it
bottles.
takes such energy, doesn't it, to keep the show on the road when we're behaving like that in the evening. It takes enormous energy to just pretend that everything is fine. And it's far from
Exactly.
fine. And we know in our hearts, don't we, it's not at all fine. But it's so easy to pretend and nobody really guesses. And I guess that's the definition of a functioning alcoholic, isn't it? And I think the world
Absolutely.
is full of them.
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. I I moved. So the ex-husband that I'd broken up with at that time, we got together again and got married. And he had an opportunity to go and work in America. And it was then that I really started realizing that something was very badly wrong because we moved to Southern California and couldn't work for the first 6 months because of the work visa situation. He was traveling a lot, and I really got into my yoga, which has always been a part of my life since I was as long as I can remember, actually, because my mother and my grandmother were both yogis. But there was this underbelly to this healthy Californian life that I was living, which was that when my then husband would go and travel, I would walk down to the local supermarket and there were always bottles of wine on special. And I would always buy 2 bottles, thinking, or telling myself, even though I knew that I would drink them both, I would tell myself, it's a good deal, and then I have some wine for later in the week. So I'd go to yoga for hours, come back home, I'd start writing myself lists of things to do rather than drink, and I would always end up drunk. And my ex started phoning me to chat from wherever he was, and he'd say to me, "You're slurring." And I started covering up, and it was there where no one else was drinking. The Southern Californians, there was it was very clean living.
Yeah.
And I realized that I had no pause button, no stop button.
Yeah.
And we'd go to a pub and we'd go to a restaurant and I would drink beforehand and I'd drink afterwards just to get the same buzz that I used to get in London. And it was round about then that we started thinking about starting a family.
So were you in your 30s by then?
I was in my 30s.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was about 8 years from, say, mid-20s to early 30s. And then early 30s in California, where I remember not being able to fall pregnant and going to specialists. And there were physiological issues that needed to be dealt with. But I remember thinking in the back of my mind, maybe it's because of my drinking. And even that desire for a child, which was so powerful, wasn't enough to make me stop drinking. And it was then that I started realizing this thing has become me.
Yeah.
I think there's a saying about first the man takes
Yes.
the drink,
And then the drink takes you.
And then the drink takes you.
Yeah.
So that was it.
Yeah.
And my ex and I decided to move back to South Africa to go into the whole IVF thing. And it turned out that I was pregnant. And that was the first time that I stopped drinking for 20 years.
Wow. And was it difficult?
Not at all. That's the crazy thing. The not drinking was an absolute delight. I was overjoyed. I was overjoyed to be pregnant. I was overjoyed to not be drinking. And I absolutely loved both of my pregnancies. And when I was breastfeeding as well, I didn't drink at all. I was the model mother. And I remember feeling so released from the hold of alcohol. And then when my son started weaning, when I started weaning him, I started having the odd drink, but I'd be very careful about time and I'd express if I knew that I was going to be drinking alcohol. So I was very responsible. And by the time he was off breast milk altogether, I was back to drinking. And that's when I realized it's worse than ever because it almost felt like I was trying to make up for lost time. I was part of a group of mothers who also had little babies. And this dreadful term, suicide hour, where the babies typically cry and 5 o'clock in the afternoon and there's feeding and bathing and all that. We would all get together in the afternoon and have a number of bottles of wine.
The mommy juice.
Champagne. That's it, to make it look more acceptable.
Yeah.
And we'd all be quite glamorous and have lipstick on and drink champagne. But we were actually just getting a little bit sozzled to handle that time. And
yes, the alcohol's become a parenting aid these days almost, hasn't it?
it's not even just parenting, Janet. It's horrified me that even last night at an event I went to about AI for startups, there was one particularly difficult question that came up, and the host said, "We'll need a bottle of wine to discuss that question." And then they kept referring. There was a ripple of laughter around the room. And I remember thinking, it is so much a part of our societal way that imagine saying, "Oh, this is going to be too difficult. Let's just go and mainline some heroin." And then everyone laughs.
Or even let's smoke a cigarette. Cigarettes are pretty of a no these days, but alcohol is so normalized. And all of the marketing, of course. Every time you watch a movie, the wine or the whiskey comes out within the first 5 minutes. It's incredible.
So there was this dissonance between being a mother and taking this responsibility so seriously. There's nothing that I've taken more seriously in my life aside from my sobriety. And yet, so once I'd put my son to bed and he was looked after and I'd read the stories and I'd done all the things, I'd dive into wine. Both my children have been amazing sleepers, so I always knew that they wouldn't necessarily wake up. And I'd wake up in the morning going, I was drunk again last night. And feeling absolutely appalled and saying tonight is going to be different. And of course it wasn't. And I fell pregnant with my daughter, same thing, stopped drinking with absolute gratitude and delight. And she struggled to breastfeed, so I was back to drinking much quicker than with my son. And I remember then starting to do things like having dry Januaries, because in my mind, if I could not drink voluntarily for a month, that was definitely proof that I didn't have a problem. Meanwhile, Googling, what are the signs of being an alcoholic? And I would find time and time again that the moment I started, I would just fall off, and I would fall harder and faster than ever before. And my ex by now he had seen the writing on the wall, because what would always happen, my pattern was, and it breaks my heart to think of it now, my pattern was not to drink a lot in public.
Yeah.
So I'd typically top up before I went out, so that in public I could appear to be normal and in control, but then I'd get home and then I'd drink a lot. And when I had been drinking, I would go to this dark place. My ex would actually say that he could see my face dropping and he knew that I had turned. And I would put on sad music and I would cry and cry and cry, or I would fight with him. And the rage that came out, he always said it was disproportionate to the conflict that we were having within our marriage, because we didn't have an easy marriage, but all that unprocessed trauma and anger and hurt and abandonment came out, and he unfortunately was the recipient.
Yeah.
So he called me on it so many times, Janet, the emails saying, this is out of control. You have got to stop. You have a problem. And me saying, this time it will be different. And he'd say
I used to
me,
say, I'll just cut down. As if we can.
Janet, this is it. But it's that absolute horror, isn't it, at the thought of having to stop.
Yes. What would life be like without my wine?
Right.
Yeah.
And I remember eventually he said to me, I need you to go for a liver function test because I'm actually concerned about your health. And off I went for my liver function test, and it was perfect because I was healthy. I was yogaing, I ate well, I was doing exercise. And the liver is unbelievable in terms of its ability to regenerate. So I had this approval.
Yeah.
I then started actively looking for people to confirm that I had a problem. And I found a top psychologist in Stellenbosch who clearly, even though she's a wonderful psychologist, did not understand addiction. Because I remember I sat down in front of her and I said, the reason I'm here is because I'm deeply concerned about my relationship with alcohol. And her advice after 1 or 2 sessions was for me to try to
down.
cut back. Yes. And I said,
They always say
you don't
that,
understand.
yeah.
She said, just find that point at which you can't stop and then don't
As
go
if.
beyond there.
Yeah.
And I'd go back to her and I said, it doesn't work. And then she said, her second suggestion was for me to try a different tipple.
Yeah.
So
Well,
then I started trying to drink vodka tonic.
yeah. I know. I call it the rules. We change our drinks.
Right.
We only drink on a Tuesday and a Friday,
Oh,
and then we go ahead and break all the rules. But yeah, once we've crossed a line into dependence, there's no going back, is there? We have to accept that's not going to be part of our lives. And then put all that energy that we've spent pretending that everything's fine, we have to redirect that energy into creating an alcohol-free life that we love, that's beautiful. And we can. And we've done that, you and I.
We have now. And I'd love to hear your story on a different day. The nitty-gritty details of it.
There's a lot of similarity, actually. I was also in London, older than you, but the work hard, play hard, in recruitment even. Lots of similarities there.
Wow. It's that creating a sober, alcohol-free life. That's the first part. But then the second part for me is that you love. And
yes, it takes a lot of work.
That takes time. That takes time.
Yeah.
You're right. I remember finally going to a doctor, a medical doctor in Stellenbosch again. And he asked me exactly how much I drank. And he then took me into a little consulting room apart from all of the doctor's offices. And he sat me down and he said, "You are an alcoholic." He said, "I'm not judging you." He said, "I am also an alcoholic." And he said, "I'd say that about 80% of Stellenbosch is functioning alcoholics."
Yeah.
He said, "But you have to do something about this now." And Janet, it was a relief to hear
Yeah, good for
it.
him.
Right.
A bit of
Even-
straight talking. That's what we need, isn't it? We don't need
yeah.
people pussyfooting around it. We need someone to say, "You're an alcoholic, sort yourself out." We go, "What me?"
Absolutely.
Because this word, the alcoholic, society has stigmatized it to such an extent that society thinks that an alcoholic is the homeless man in the park. So we look at him and we think, "I'm not like him. I'm fine. I've got a good job and a nice family. I'm not an alcoholic."
Correct.
So I always say to people, we've got to compare ourselves to the best version of ourselves that we could possibly be. Never mind the homeless guy in the park. Limits our potential, even if it doesn't destroy us all. So good for that
absolutely.
doctor. And so how did you think about going to AA, incidentally?
So I'd thought about it and I had reached out to people many times. Many times. I remember saying to my best friend, who was a clinical psychologist, I remember saying to her, "I am deeply concerned about my drinking. I think I'm an alcoholic. I want to go to rehab." And she looked me in the eyes. She'd known me for my entire drinking life. And she said to me, "You do not have a drinking problem. You do not need to go to rehab. Spend that money on couples counseling with your partner." And incidentally, she was the one person who has pretty much permanently left my life since I stopped drinking. And yes, I had reached out to people so many times. I had attended AA meetings, but it didn't resonate with me because I'm not a Christian. And I think that I was also still looking for excuses to not actually deal with what I knew was there. And my turning point came one New Year when I had said to my ex-husband, "This is going to be another dry January." And I got drunk on New Year's Day.
Not a good
And
start.
Not a good start. And it was because there was lots of leftover booze. You know the story. There's always a reason. There was leftover booze, and I thought I'll get rid of it. And he'd taken the children out, and it was a beautiful day. And I knew that was the day. And it was almost like going out in a ball of flames. When he got home and he saw that I was drunk, he said, "This is it." And I actually slept at my parents' house that night. And I woke up the next morning woozy, confused, but with a sick feeling in my stomach. And he walked into the room that I was sleeping in and he said, "If you don't stop this, I'm taking the children." And that was the moment. And I reached out to a GP, the GP that I'd seen, and said, "I need help." And they said, "Here are 3 places that you can contact." And the third one I contacted, this Dr. Pierre Lowe at Scienza. He said, "Come in and bring your husband." And I went in and we both sat down, and after half an hour, he explained alcoholism and he uses the disease model. And I remember him writing on the whiteboard behind him, "This is a degenerative, obsessive compulsive disease. And basically, it's going to kill you."
Oh, yeah.
And he went into the neuroscience of it. And he said, "Let's fight the disease and not the person." And he said to me, "Are you going to stop?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Today?" And I went, "No, tomorrow." And I said to my husband, "I'd like to go out for a meal and I want to have a bottle of wine to mark the end of this journey." And he was so nervous. I remember sitting in my yoga studio before we went out and drinking a bottle of wine, because I knew that one bottle wouldn't be enough for me at the dinner table. And we went out for a meal, and it was very civilized, and then that was that. And I never ever looked back. And I think the reason I never looked back is because I had relapsed so many times before.
Yeah.
So by the time I got to this man, with this outpatient program, I went 3 times a week for about 6 months. And then I kept going once a week for about 2 years. I was so excited about being
Yes.
sober.
Yeah.
Did you have
I
that as
say to
well?
people, oh yeah,
Oh,
but initially I was very depressed at the prospect
oh
of
yes.
life without alcohol. But as time went on, I was thinking, wow, this is great. And now when people join Tribe Sober, they're often depressed. And I say,
Yeah.
be excited. This is a
Yeah.
life-changing journey and you're just starting on it. And I've
That's
seen
it.
again and again people's lives open up to a
Oh,
huge degree. It's really something to be excited about. But we have to change our mindset, don't we? So that we no longer see alcohol as something desirable. We just see it for the poison that it is. And that's when
yeah.
things become easier because we don't yearn for it anymore.
Correct. Correct. I was depressed at the thought of stopping, and I was very depressed once I stopped. And what I was depressed about was the fact that it felt like a veil had been lifted from my eyes, because I knew that I would see my marriage to be unfulfilling, and I did. I knew that I would see motherhood to be very hard, and I did. I knew that I would have to face up to all of my demons from my past that I had never actually processed. And that is an ongoing thing. I'm
I'm
still
sure.
unpacking that now. And I actually laugh because when I turned 50 last week, so many people have said to me, gosh, I wouldn't have said that you're 50. And I know that it's
No,
got
you
nothing
look
to do.
great. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Janet. But I don't think that it's got anything to do with my looks. I think it's got everything to do with the fact that there is still a really, and I say this with compassion for myself, childlike way of about me.
Yeah.
And I put that down to the fact that it's said that we stop growing emotionally when we
Yes.
start drinking. Have you heard?
Yes,
Right.
absolutely. Because our emotional maturity, it just stalls, doesn't it? Because
Correct.
we're numbing our feelings, so we don't know how to cope with all of those feelings. And we say to people when they stop drinking with us, we say, you've got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable now. And that's how you do it when you're desperate for a drink because you've got all these feelings. Just sit with the feelings, they won't kill you and they'll
You
pass.
are right.
Yeah,
You're right.
yeah.
But that's the thing. So I feel like if I effectively stopped growing emotionally at the age of, say, 15, and then I stopped drinking 10 years ago, I'm really only 25 now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was
And
18 for a long time.
right. And it's a good and a bad thing. So yes, the sitting with it, that's the really mature adult hard stuff to do.
Yeah, yeah,
And this is why I teach people mindfulness, because for me it's the only way to cope with a world that is so full of disappointment and sadness and
yeah,
difficulty and challenge.
yeah.
But there is also such a wonderful thing about having this almost delayed adulthood, because
Yes.
there is still a youthfulness and a joy and a fun
Mm,
to doing some things and being fully present.
mm.
That perhaps if we'd been maturing according to our chronological age, we would have become numb to that by now or blasé
Yes.
about it. So,
And also, when you think about those normal drinkers, one that can have 1 or 2 glasses, those people that we were always very jealous of, they don't
yes,
actually get this opportunity, do they, to almost have a rebirth and live life very
yes,
differently because they don't need to. And I don't know if
right.
you've seen that book by Laura McCowan called We Are the Luckiest, but I like that
No,
kind of, have a look at that. It's brilliant.
I will. I
She's
will.
great. And her argument is that this might seem like our worst nightmare, having to give up alcohol, but in fact, it's the best thing that's ever happened to us. And I agree with that now, but obviously it takes time.
I think also, so I agree with you completely, and I agree as well about the taking time. I think that what made it unbearable for me is the fact that had accepted 100% that I would never be able to drink like
Yes.
those
Yeah.
freaks.
Yes. Normal
And I
people.
say that
Those,
with yes.
what do they call them at AA? They call them normies.
Right. And I remember hearing that trying to moderate when you're an alcoholic is like getting into a boxing ring where you are going to get knocked out every time.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
duck and dive and try to avoid this, but you're going to get that sucker punch. And the only way that you can ever avoid that is to just not step in the ring. So even on my worst days, and I've been dipping into menopause the last 18 months without even realizing it, buying a new home, renovating, it has been an absolute shit show, to use a very refined term. And not even at my lowest point did I think about drinking. And that's how I know that I am on the right path, because I've accepted that there is nothing so bad that alcohol won't make it worse.
Absolutely.
And that helps.
Yeah, and this moderation thing, we call it the moderation trap. And I spent a whole decade trying and failing to moderate. And the worst thing about that is that you're just doing the hardest bit over and over again, because those first few weeks, and then you manage it for a while, and then you drink to black out, and then you start again. It's a miserable cycle to be trapped in. And what I didn't realize when I was trapped in that was that it's so much easier just to ditch the stuff. And then it's all right, it's a shit show, to paraphrase you, for 6 months maybe. And then you get a whole new life. So it's so worth that investment.
Absolutely. What I found very helpful as well was understanding the typical timeline of recovery. And
Yes.
I'm sure that there are many variations on this, but my understanding of it, and I've used this with a lot of people who've approached me about stopping as well, is that typically 0 to 15 days would be your withdrawal.
Yeah.
And then 15 to 45, more or less, would be your honeymoon.
Yes, the
That's
pink
your
cloud.
honeymoon. Yes, where your dopamine levels are spiking because suddenly your body doesn't have its drug, so it has to produce, and it overproduces. And then you hit the wall. And the wall can last anything from 45 to 90 or whatever it might be. But then once you're beyond that, then you start to regulate your neurotransmitters. All of that starts to level, and you actually start showing up in a way that feels manageable. And this is why I have such an issue with rehabs, inpatient rehabs that release people just as they're going to hit the wall. It drives me so
Absolutely.
mad.
And often
Right.
release them into the world with no coping mechanisms. They've just locked them away from booze for 3 weeks. What's that going to achieve? And that's what
Making their
always
money.
stopped me going to rehab. I thought it'll be great that I don't drink for 3 weeks, but what on earth happens after that?
And then you get that white knuckling, which to me
Yeah.
is such a heartbreaking term, right? That sense
Yeah,
of just holding on for dear life.
Yes.
Because I remember once doing a bungee jump at that very high bridge on the garden route. And I remember, no, it was a bridge swing. I remember standing there, and you have to stand with your toes over the edge of the ledge that you're going to jump off. And the weight of the rope starts pulling you forward. And I remember trying to lean back, but just feeling that this resistance was futile. And that sooner or later you're just going to get pulled off. And that's that white knuckling. That is...
Yeah.
God, I feel anxious even thinking about it. Like you say, the energy that you expend trying to fight or trying to moderate or trying to control this beast.
Yes, willpower doesn't work, full stop. There's been a lot of research into willpower quite recently, and they've, concluded it's a finite resource. So it might get you through dry January. I used to do that too, to prove I didn't have a problem. But you can't sustain your sobriety with willpower. That's when you have to change your thinking about drinking and realize that it's going to destroy you if you carry on. So yeah, because that's all in our subconscious, really. That the way that we see alcohol, all those limiting beliefs that we have to smash. We have to realise that yes, we can socialise without alcohol. Yes, we can relax without alcohol, and then we learn how to do that. So
I
it's so
love
much more than
that.
willpower.
I love what you just said because people often say to me, "Gosh, Nicci, you're the strongest person I know because you've been sober." And I'm going, "This is easy."
Yes, yes.
You know,
Keeping that show on
relatively.
the road with a stonking hangover, that was difficult.
Correct. So it's almost like pick your difficult.
Yes, choose
Yeah.
your hard, we say sometimes.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's one of our coaches, Lynette. She's brilliant. When she
Yeah.
was trying to quit drinking, she went to her therapist and she said,
Yeah.
"Oh, this is so hard." And the therapist said to her, "What's wrong with hard?" And I love that. But we
Love
have to
that.
choose our hard because, yes, it's hard to give up drinking in those first few months, but how much harder to carry on destroying ourselves and think.
Yeah.
I say to people sometimes, fast forward 10 years into the future, if you're still drinking, what is your life going to look like?
Yeah.
And mine, I would have destroyed myself, certainly. I was well on the way. Yeah. Yeah. I always say drinking's great fun until it's not. And the
Right.
clever
Yes.
people recognize that moment when it's not fun
Yes.
anymore and they do something about it. But some of
Correct.
us carry on for decades because it's such a deeply ingrained habit.
Yeah. And I have to say, when I was thinking about stopping, long before I actually stopped, I reached out to everyone that I knew who'd stopped drinking because I needed to hear that it was possible. And not just possible, but that it could be amazing.
Yes,
And
yes.
yeah, having someone who is relatable is
Yeah,
such a gift
yeah.
to say, maybe I can't see myself doing this life without my thing. But if they can do it, maybe I can too.
Yeah,
So,
and the community thing works so well because we've been doing this for 8 years. We've got people in our community that have been sober for years now. So the newbies, they see these people and they think, wow, if they can do it, maybe I can. And they seem to have a really nice life. They don't complain that it's dull and boring without alcohol. So you need that inspiration of people further down the road, don't you? It's no good if
absolutely.
everybody's at day one because you'll probably all relapse together. But having people at
Exactly.
all stages of the journey is great. Yeah. So let's talk about coaching. When and why did you decide to study coaching?
When I separated from my ex husband, I realized that I was going to have to start earning proper money. And I'd been working in non-profit. Since I got back from the States, I started working in non-profit and as a yoga teacher. And it was passion work, but it definitely wasn't going to support me in becoming financially independent. And I've always been interested in psychology and I've always been fascinated by people. And I have this deep belief that we all have this knowing within us and that sometimes we just need a little bit of assistance to tap into that knowing. And what appealed to me about coaching when I was thinking about what a potential repositioning of myself could be, I loved the fact with coaching that you aren't ever telling someone what to do,
Yeah.
that you are trained to ask the kind of questions that can tap into their deepest knowing and to help them to see how they are getting in their own way. And I think about it, if I'd had someone to coach me in my active addiction, to say to me, what do you really feel that you know about your drinking? I would have said, I need to stop. And asking, but why aren't you? And dealing with those objections, those obstacles. Yeah, I think I would have stopped a lot sooner, but who knows? I'd also found through my yoga teaching that when people booked private classes with me, they very often just wanted someone to hold space for them while they were working their way through difficult times,
Yeah.
whether it was bereavement or relationship issues or whatever it might be. And so I didn't really know if I would have the ability to coach, but I thought I'm going to give it a try. And I did one course first through UCT, and I absolutely loved it. And then I did another course through ThoughtSmiths. I did the phase 1 and phase 2. And it was just before COVID hit. It was actually quite a while before COVID hit, but I'd already been trained on how to work online. So by the time the world went online, I was already comfortable working in this way. And it's just never been, I've never looked back.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so the kind of coaching that I do is life coaching, and then also working with execs.
Let's just wind up a little. We could talk all day, obviously.
We could.
So if someone's listening to this, Nicci, and they know that they've got to make a change, just as we knew for too many years, what would you say to them? Because the most difficult thing, isn't it, is accepting that you have a problem and then reaching out for help. What would you say to them? What can they do as a first step?
As a first step, I would say reaching out to someone who's going to call them on their bullshit.
Yeah. They need to find someone
Because-
like that doctor you found.
Exactly.
Because we don't really listen to the husbands so much, do we? I mean, mine told me for at least a year that I had, 10 years, I had a terrible problem and I really had to address it. But it's just like a kind of buzzing in your ear, isn't it? But sitting in front of a doctor, that's different.
Yeah, yeah. And also someone who's heard it all before.
Yeah.
I think that's really valuable because friends, meaning friends, don't want the dynamics in a friendship to change very often. And very often people have a vested subconscious interest in you carrying on being the way
Yeah.
that you are.
Especially if
So-
they're drinkers, they don't want anything to change. And if they're not drinkers, they'll say, cut down. It's
So-
friends aren't the place to go, really. You need someone that will really call you out on your bullshit, as you say.
That's it. And who's heard it all before, who will say, I tend to say to people, I look for things like the blackouts.
Yeah.
If they're blackouts, if you are unable to moderate, those for me are already signs that you are probably an alcoholic.
Yeah, and drinking alone. And then coming back from an event, I used to do that, where you look very much in control and then you come home and start drinking alone.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And waking up
yeah.
with bruises.
Oh,
So being able to-
UDIs, unidentified drinking incident.
absolutely awful. For me, I would say reach out to someone who you know is going to tell you what you don't want to hear.
Yeah. And would you do that for your coaching clients?
Absolutely.
Good. Yeah.
I say to people, because I'm very open about my recovery because I am so flippin' proud of it. And when people phone me for mentoring or coaching and they're still drinking, I say to them, I'm not going to take your money while you're still drinking because you need to first stop drinking. Because I know that I threw money at anything and everything except stopping.
Yeah.
And so many of us do that. We try to change our partner, our job. We blame our relationship, the load shedding, everything, until eventually we have to stop. So I say to people who've called me up, I'll say, call me when you're actually in recovery, and then let's talk. Because I feel actually that it's unethical to take someone's money while they are still in active addiction.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they are going to self-sabotage. That might sound really brutal, but it's my policy, and I'll say to someone, I refer them to Sayenza, I'll send them to yourselves. I'll say, get the help that you need
Yeah.
to deal with that thing. And then you will see your life as it is. You'll see it. There's a term in
Yes.
yoga, vipassana, which is where you see things more clearly.
So your coaching is for the stage when we've been sober for a few months and we think we've got it, but we're thinking, now what? I'm sober, now
Yeah.
what? Let's
And very
explore who I
often,
am and what I really want to do.
exactly. And very often it'll be things like, I've realized that I can't bear to be with my partner anymore. Or, yeah, it can be big things like that. And I
Yeah, we've
remember
seen
hearing,
people make big changes, leave the
right,
partner, leave the job, change countries, big
yes,
things, but they were things that needed to be done. And that's why drinking keeps you stuck, doesn't it? It keeps you stuck because you can't see things clearly and you've got no energy to do anything about anything because you're so busy keeping the show on the road and pretending that you're fine.
oh man,
But yeah,
yeah,
quit drinking, get all the energy, talk to someone like yourself about what happens next, and life will be very different. So, how
yeah.
can people contact you?
The easiest way is through my website, which is meta, M-E-T-A, numbers365.com. So metta is the Sanskrit word for loving kindness, which is my
Oh, nice.
approach.